scripts, please. All right, everybody, welcome to our second Wikidata 10th birthday speaker series. I'm so glad you could join us, and I want to extend a special welcome to all of our panelists who I'll introduce in just a second. But as I said, this is our second of four webinars celebrating Wikidata turning 10, which is going to happen on October 29th. Please mark that down in your calendars. There's a lot of events happening in addition to ours, so I'll be sure to share those dates and details with you, or someone will at some point in this talk. So if you want to attend those, you can. But today I would love to welcome Joe, Kiley, and Chris, who will be talking about their Wikidata projects and how they started theirs. We'll be having a great conversation about it, and I'll be sure to leave some time for a question and answer at the end. If you do have a question, feel free to drop it in the question and answer section of the Zoom webinar, and then we can kind of go through those as the chat continues. So I don't want anyone to forget anything. And then, yeah, we'll just take it from there. So it's my pleasure to introduce Joe Cera, who is the Digital Initiatives and Scholarly Communications Librarian at the Berkeley Law Library. Kiley Jolicouer, who is the Metadata Strategies Librarian at the Department of Digital Stewardship at Syracuse University Libraries. She's used Wikibase to build a proof of concept repository for transforming digital collections metadata into linked data. We'll hear more about that in a bit. And Chris Long, who is the director of the Resource Descriptions Services team at the University of Colorado Boulder Libraries. And Chris took our Wiki education course in July 2021. So everyone here is an old friend of ours. So welcome to the three of you. Thanks for taking the time to join us. I know you all have very busy schedules. I'd like to start things off with just a little overview of all the projects that you've been working on recently on Wikidata, or the one that you want to highlight for all of us. So Chris, would you mind giving a brief overview of what you've been doing?
Sure. So the one that our first project here involved a group of women poets from the Romantic period who were part of a digital ebook collection that was housed in our library. And this actually started off as a name authority project because the curators of those wanted some broader exposure. And once I got some exposure to Wikidata, I said, well, we can extend this project into the Wikidata realm too. And like, why stop at making authority records for these people? Let's just get them really out there on the web and create Wikidata items for them. So that project is has been sort of stalled for a little bit, but we did complete a 200 or so Wikidata items. Right now I'm working on a project to either create or enhance Wikidata items for all the faculty on our campus. And so after talking about that for a year and a half, I think within the next 2 or 3 weeks, I'm actually going to launch that with my whole team. So sort of excited about that.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Chris. Kiley, would you mind going next?
Sure. So I started a project with WB Stack last summer around July. I took the same Wiki education course that Chris did. So I took the Wikidata course last summer. And I was working on an internship project. I was a graduate student at the time, still with Syracuse University Libraries. And we had needed to start considering methods of authority control. We were migrating away from a local digital collection system onto Cortex, which is a digital asset management system. And we had some local authority control capability in our kind of homegrown system, but Cortex at the moment does not have an actual native authority control capability. There are ways to kind of create ways to do it, but no integral kind of capacity for doing so at the moment. It's a fairly new system. So we were looking at ways to kind of address this, especially because we want to have our information integrated with the cataloging department as well, and not just kind of have two separate siloed sets of data. And so I was looking at using a local instance of WB Stack, which is related to now Wikibase Cloud, and considering how we could use that in order to build our kind of existing metadata into linked data and use it as our authority control system.
That's so cool. I'm glad that you're able to work on that. That's great. Thanks, Kiley. And Joe, would you tell us a little bit about what you've been working on?
Yeah, sure. So similarly with the authority control, mine is repository related, but I was trying to find a way to assign a consistent authority to all of the faculty members to make it easier to identify them in the repository. I also sort of, without really thinking about my interactions with Wikidata, I did it more in a backwards way. And then I was like, oh, cool, I can learn Open Refine and break Wikidata at the same time. And so I just like charged through and did it. And so it sort of extended from just authors to, I'm also working on a project where I'm trying to identify and make sure that the various journals that I use in the repository with their abbreviations also have links to websites instead of just almost nothing or nothing at all.
Also very cool. Thanks for that overview, Joe, and to the three of you for doing these cool projects. So my first question for you is for anyone starting off a new Wikidata project, which is kind of, how did this project come to be? Like, what were the steps, or like what needed to fall together in order for you to start work on this? So who's just itching to share their story first?
Ooh, I'll go.
Great.
So for me, it was the repository platform we were using had like no sense of like an identifier for people, and it was all like merging based on email addresses, which, as you can imagine, is not great. And so what I had originally done is I was like, oh well, I can just create this identifier field and I'll just give everybody an identifier. And I started with the internal ones and was like, well, this is stupid because nobody knows what these identifiers are. And so I expanded out to like, well, let's look at what's publicly available. You know, I ended up with the standard via ISNI, Library of Congress, that sort of thing. And I found it really frustrating to have like a system, and I identify a system where I couldn't edit anything, I couldn't add things. You know, it was just like either it existed and I could celebrate, or it didn't. And to have a system where not everybody could have the same, be in the same platform was really frustrating. So again, it's sort of the stumbling into Open Refine and Wikidata at the same time. I was just like, oh, I can just do this and nobody will say anything because nobody's paying attention to what I'm doing. Those Wikidata people aren't going to yell at me, will they? And they didn't. Well, they kind of did, but only because they should when you make big mistakes.
Oh, those Wikidata people. That's awesome. And Kylie, Chris, how'd you get started with your projects?
So ours kind of came about as a result of a conversation between myself and our department supervisor. And we were kind of discussing some of the work that I had done previously when I was a new graduate student working for the department, and how I was doing a lot of name reconciliation, et cetera. I was using the reconciliation with Wikidata in Open Refine, like Joe just mentioned. And we were kind of just chatting about it. It wasn't necessarily like a planning sort of meeting. And she happened to mention using Wikidata. And I was like, okay, like I've been using Wikidata a lot to do kind of the reconciliation. And I was like, I wonder how we could use that. So we were like, all right, what do I need to know about how to actually kind of participate in creating things with it versus just kind of using the information on it, which of course is still important. And so that's kind of where I started, was figuring out what I needed to know, which I solved by kind of taking that that course, of course, and going from there. Now I know how to do this. How do I want to move forward further? So I started creating a sandbox in a local instance of WB Stack and using what I had learned from the course to kind of structure our data in a similar way. And I think the kind of hardest part about starting any sort of project like that is making sure that you have the bandwidth to do it. Because as wonderful as the community and the tools and everything are, you have to put the time into actually being able to do it, just like anything else. So I think that was kind of the hardest thing, is figuring out where it fit into everything else that I was doing and that the department was doing.
That makes sense. And Chris?
Okay, so like all of my sort of stick my toe in the water of linked data things, mine started out with the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, the PCC, and the PCC has been trying to move our traditional cataloging practices into the linked data realm for several years. And they would typically offer, at our May meeting, they would typically offer something on a Friday afternoon, some sort of linked data experience. And the last one we had in May 2019 was on Wikidata. And it was kind of, we were given just a little bit of background beforehand, but it was kind of in about 5 minutes, say, you know, a talk ahead of time, and then it's ready, set, go. Get in there and start creating Wikidata items, which we sort of did, stumbling around and things like that. And I thought it was really cool. I could definitely see a connection between that and sort of like our traditional authority control practices we've been doing. And so I got, you know, now that I had just enough knowledge to be dangerous, once I got back to my library, I go, how can I apply this? You know, and this project we've been working on with the women poets of the Romantic period, this NACO project, I go, this is a perfect way to just sort of add on to that project. And so I could see the value in, well, a lot of the women poets in this collection, some of them are very well known, but many are very obscure and really had no online presence before. So I could see a value in both promoting the digital collection itself and these poets, you know, some of which come from, you know, they came from very they were, you know, housekeepers and things like that, a very wide background. And so I sort of got our NACO folks together, and you know, we started creating NACO records for these people, ISNIs, and ultimately Wikidata items for them. And so the pandemic sort of oddly stalled this, because it is sort of a thing you could do from home, but some of them are so obscure that we had to rely on print resources for some of the biography. So that kind of stalled. But then I thought, you know, I need to start getting my whole staff involved in something. And we've done the normal linked data courses, and we've played around with some, you know, beta linked data editors and things like that. And I think it's like, all right, we're getting a little tired of this. I wanted something where my folks could actually get in and actually create linked data. And Wikidata is a perfect, I think, way to do this. And so I needed something big enough that could keep 12 people busy. And I think that this project we have with our CU Boulder faculty, everything I do, I want to also bring value to our campus or to our institution. And I think this will, because I think, again, it will raise the online presence of some of our faculty. 60% of our faculty don't have a Wikidata item. And of the other 40%, some don't have an affiliation to CU Boulder and their Wikidata items. So I sort of see some synergy there. But the main thing is I want to give my catalogers some really hands-on linked data experience where they're actually creating it, not just, you know, experimenting with it. So
it is a great place to get your hands dirty. There's no way around it. So this kind of brings me to my next question, which is for anyone who's interested. Wikidata isn't like your typical, like, nice boxed programmatic experience. It's kind of a little bit everywhere. There's no manual you can crack open to like read about what step to follow next. Did you have to do any convincing to people to say like Wikidata is the way to go? Did you have to like ask for time or resources from anyone? Was there anything that you had to like win over, or anyone you had to win over? Or if not, what did you say to just like get everybody on board?
Well, I'll pipe in at first. So I certainly didn't have to sell this to the administration. I think we've been involved in sort of linked data projects before, and so this was just sort of a natural outgrowth of that. There's a big difference though between how you create name authority records in the LC authority file and Wikidata. And so trying to suppress our NACO brains and embrace the other possibilities that something like Wikidata has, there wasn't a lot of convincing, but I sort of had to say, okay, yes, there are so many more things we can put in a Wikidata item than we can put in a NACO record. But NACO records have very stringent rules, very rigid rules that we follow. Well, Wikidata is sort of a little bit of the Wild West for, metadata. And so that freedom, giving ourselves the freedom to do these things is a mind shift. So it wasn't so much convincing, but it was encouraging my folks to say, okay, we don't have to do just the same things we did in NACO records. Let's embrace all the possibilities we can. So.
Yeah, sort of building off of that, this project is at a very different point than everything that Chris's team is working on. We haven't actually moved to full adoption yet, just because of kind of where we are in the process with migrating everything that we have, migrating not only our digital objects, but also, of course, the metadata and everything. So we're in our second phase of that project, and we're still going, we're still working on it. And this work was done last year and it was well received. Everyone was very interested in the possibilities of it. And I think something that was a little bit different in the way that we were approaching this as a consideration, and still considering it, of course, moving forward, but we're just not quite there yet to deciding what we're going to do. But is the fact that because our data is so specific and the way that we want to use it is so specific to kind of internal use, that it wasn't a great fit for us to use Wikidata itself. But we do use it. And in that data that we would produce on our own kind of little Wikibase instance, we would still be linking to Wikidata items and everything like that. So there would still be very much an integration with Wikidata itself. But the way that our linked data is structured and everything, moving it over, and that ability to kind of use our own specific authority control just required us to be a little bit more specific about it. But at the same time, that gives us the opportunity to actually make all of that data available to our users and have all of that publicly accessible, allowing users to do querying in a way that's, of course, different from just searching in the digital collections. And our search feature works really well on Cortex. We've been happy with kind of the user experience with that, but querying the data is different than, searching in a digital collection. So it was kind of a different approach with different considerations, and we're at a different stage, but everything that we were thinking about was well received and everyone was pretty happy with it. And I think we'll need to consider, a few other approaches as well that we kind of never got to, just that way we can say, yeah, this isn't for us. But the ability to make all of the data public rather than kind of even in a triple store that makes it available, the kind of ability to actually be able to look at it, to query it right there in a little bit easier of a user interface was a major perk for us.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that I've been very lucky to be in a place where whenever I sort of have an idea like, oh, hey, I was thinking, let's use Wikidata for identifiers for faculty authors. And, nobody is sold right away, but they're not like, no, they're like, yeah, this might be useful down the way. The law scholarship generally is kind of behind everything else. I mean, can't even get the law journals to use DOIs. But, there was this idea, like at the time, a few years ago, ORCID was finally making its way into discussions at the law schools. And there was sort of the discussion of like, well, why don't we use ORCIDs instead of Wikidata identifiers? Because that's like, everybody's talking about it. And the whole point of it is, part of what made it convincing is to say like, well, we can, like, one of the benefits of using Wikidata is that we can include anything that we want. And if we just decide like, okay, we don't want to use Wikidata, we'll use something else, it's already there, like the system is already there. And it turned out like, that the argument of we can abandon this at any point and we lose nothing, like that's lovely. And then I think that when we finally needed to use any sort of resources related to Wikidata, if we were in a space where we were already, like for the repository, we started using the API to build views, and Wikidata is very friendly for pulling stuff from. And so if you already have those identifiers, it turns out like you have all these other connections that are almost immediately available. And so when it was time to use resources, it was like, oh yeah, well, look, this we already set ourselves up to, to add value here. So this is great. And, I think that I don't know that too many people are looking, but nobody's looking back at least. So that's something.
Yeah, that's a really big deal. This is all excellent insight. Thank you for sharing a little bit of background about these projects. And I would go so far to say that these are all successful projects, even if they're not adopted to. So like, what has made your projects work? Oh,
You froze for a bit.
can everyone hear me? Just building a little tension into the hour. Everything can't run smoothly. What I was going to ask is, I think you all have successful projects, and what do you attribute some of these successes to? And maybe it's Wikidata related, maybe it's something else. I just know we all come from different places, and as we all try to start our own projects, there's a lot of moving pieces. So if there's something that jumps to your mind, feel free to share it.
I have a big one right off the bat. I think the success of kind of the sandbox that I built was largely based upon the fact that you have to understand when you're doing any kind of project, but especially a project that's dealing with data, that it has to be iterative. You're going to find stuff that you did that you absolutely hate, that it didn't work, that it just isn't working quite good enough, it doesn't work well with something else, etc. Any of the kind of 101 reasons that it could have some issues. And you have to be willing to backtrack and rip some stuff out and kind of redo part of it. And that was something that when I started, I was like, okay, like I have this plan, our application profile makes this fairly easy for kind of importing into the linked data pretty much right off the bat, but it's never that simple. And I think there were a lot of things that were very frustrating that I was like, you know what, this is just not working. I need to address this. So whether it's working in Wikidata itself or a local instance of Wikibase, just kind of that willingness to understand that even if you already are familiar with what you're doing and you don't think there's going to be a learning curve, there's still a learning curve with everything. And every project dealing with data and metadata, it's going to have to be iterative. So just knowing that there's going to be kind of adaptive decisions along the way.
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of the success comes from first, like the support of my supervisor, which is a nice thing to push any project forward. And then also having a web developer who is interested in doing it, so that instead of, I could do some of this, but in order to make it actually useful and where someone else can understand, you need someone who can, take the words that I'm using and the data that I've created and show that it can be made to be a useful thing. And so I think having that is really supportive, because nobody just wants to hear me talk about the potential of Wikidata, because you can hear that anywhere. But and then I think also because there's such a low barrier to entry, like there's been a lot of opportunities for me to be able to pull in other people who are like not familiar with Wikidata, but I have this project. Here's how it works. You can clearly see the connections, even if you're not comfortable interacting with the data. You can fill out a spreadsheet, and that by itself can help improve the data down the line. And I think the ability to include other people at sort of any step of the process has been really useful.
Yeah, and I would say, well, part of our success has been that I was able to get that buy-in from my PCC catalogers, because once they got into it, they could see, oh yeah, this is really cool. This is just an extension of what we're already doing, what we've been doing for a long time. And it's like, and now they feel like, it's like, wow, this linked data thing isn't so scary, and they're beginning to see how we could use this, in our production environment. But one thing I would also suggest when you're starting out is you sort of have to decide, I think at the beginning, what's the scope of the project? How many resources do I have? And, don't think it's don't try to take on too much. I would think for your initial project, kind of keep it small. And I love what Kiley said. I remember what you said, Kiley, is adaptive something, something adaptive. That's right. Because Wikidata is like, there's a lot of rabbit holes. I mean, it's like breeding rabbits, because Wikidata items beget other Wikidata items. And so you can, unless you've really sort of scoped out and decided, okay, this is sort of what we're going to do, at least at the beginning of this project, and sort of learn that and adapt as you go along, you could start finding yourself really straying and getting to the point where, you know, you may never finish the project or something like that. So the good thing that I like about Wikidata is, like, you don't have to do everything. Yeah, other people can come in and add information to your Wikidata items and things like that. So you don't have to take on the whole world with your project. Just try to learn and realize that you are going to not get it right the first time. Well, it's not that you won't get it right, but it may not be as complete as you would like it. And you can go back and change it and fix it as you learn more things. So it's definitely a learning, it's a learning journey. So.
I mean, that resonates. Oh, sorry. Go for it.
I just want to jump in and say, for me, I feel like thinking and planning, that was a second project thing. But for me, the first project is dive in, make mistakes, do all the wrong things first, because I feel like it's first, as you mentioned, people will fix your errors, and they're pretty kind about acknowledging somebody coming in and making lots of errors. But also, you know, the part of the experience of any Wikidata project is, like, the first time or the first couple of times, like, you don't really understand the possibilities, and so you know, for some of us, we can plan forever and never do it because it's too intimidating, and for some of us, it's just like, well, let's see what this thing can do, and then realize, okay, it can do a lot. I better make some different decisions for the next one.
I was just going to add too, in hearing all about these projects and working with a lot of new and semi-new Wikidatans, it's interesting that the project process that you all described reflects just like the regular day-to-day on Wikidata, where it's like building consensus, being adaptive, being iterative, not being an expert at everything, but being responsible for everything, and then like kind of stumbling through it that way. But it's a collective experience. Great responses, thanks. My next question is, you know, about learning more about Wikidata, because there's nothing that covers everything like a bad blanket. You know, you can't like check every single box that exists for Wikidata. So I'm wondering where you three personally go to learn more about what you do to help with your projects.
I think the number one place isn't even like a specific resource hosted on Wikidata, but it's other people. It's other people working on the same sorts of projects, or other people who are Wikidata editors, etc. So, I mean, the whole kind of community that's just constellations of people working in different areas on different things is really invaluable, regardless of what you're trying to do, because there will be a community that is also doing what you're doing, or maybe something slightly different that challenges what you're doing and kind of brings in new ideas. So being aware of everything else that's going on and being able to kind of make those connections with folks, which is great, because I mean, the community is so friendly and so helpful and always willing to kind of weigh in on ideas, whether it's, you know, something you totally haven't considered, or just helping you solve a problem that you just can't quite figure out on your own. It's been very helpful to be able to talk to other people, I think, most of all.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely like when you start talking about Wikidata with somebody else who is working on a project, and inevitably, you know, it's the conversation turns into discussions about properties and how you do things, which I think is really interesting, because it's clear that everybody has a different way of approaching the same thing, and a lot of the values that you put into Wikidata, like it kind of depends on where you're coming from and what feels like the appropriate property to use for something. Also, Will, as you know, when I don't understand something, I send you an email, and then you're like, oh, hey, I wrote a blog post about that. Like lists, list items in Wikidata. Like that's a confusing thing that doesn't make any sense until someone explains it to you. And so it's definitely the, just looking around and reaching out to anybody else who's working on it, I think makes the biggest difference.
Yeah, I was fortunate that shortly after we started our project with the women poets, the PCC created their own Wikidata pilot project. And so it was natural for us to just fold that in. And that gave me a whole cohort of people, most of whom I already knew and, trusted their, their experience and expertise. And so, yeah, no one really, and there was all manner of projects in that pilot. And I learned a lot in preparing for our faculty project from places like Stanford and University of Washington, because they'd also been doing faculty identifier projects. And while they didn't always make the same decisions, it was interesting to see how they put their template together, their description template and things like that. So there is a community, there's a great community of people out there who've already sort of made a small path where there's no path really before. So it's great to I think the community, that's one of the biggest benefits of Wikidata. The community is very active. There's a lot of people doing a lot of different things. So I'm a cataloger. I do cataloger type things with it, but there's so many cool projects going on. So
That's so true. It's overwhelming in a really fun way, and a little scary sometimes. But somebody before, I think it was you, Chris, said Wikidata is the Wild West of metadata. I love that analogy, and I'm gonna run with it a little bit farther. So being data wranglers isn't for everybody. And the three of you, there's something inside that this just clicks and makes sense. So I'm wondering what it is that you see in Wikidata that gets you excited, that seems different enough from traditional data repositories or library tools. Well, like however you want to frame it, what gets you excited the most?
I mean, for me, there's sort of like, I mentioned when I first started using it, I kind of expected someone to be like, whoa, you don't know what you're doing here, and maybe somebody left that in a talk portion of that, and I didn't read it, but it's very much like when you first start using it, you're like, oh, I'm digging around in someone else's sandbox. I wonder what's going to happen, and like first, nobody even notices. It's a massive sandbox. Nobody cares. And also, like, if you are there contributing, like, it makes people really happy, and like that positive feedback of like, I have data here that it doesn't exist in this place where I know other applications are pulling from this data. I'll add this data, and then it will be out there, and people will be able to use it. And that, I think, that positive feedback, like, I mean, as Chris says, when you start working with Wikidata, one project creates another project, and I think part of it is just you start seeing like, oh, I have all of this data that I could just make available, that should be available, and it feels really good to do that in a public space instead of something that feels really siloed.
Yeah, I think in that same sort of vein, the fact that when you have some information, but maybe not a complete picture, and you are viewing an item and you see, okay, well, this information is not there, but I know this and I have a citation for it. You can add where you can contribute without necessarily being responsible for the, frankly, massive undertaking of having a complete, complete information doesn't exist, but as complete as possible about something. And I think that sometimes people misunderstand that as a weakness of Wikidata, where it's not quote unquote complete information in a lot of places. But I think that's what's such a wonderful opportunity about it, and what makes it such a wonderful resource, especially for contributors, is the fact that you can fill in those missing pieces as you go. So I tend to be, using it for authority control, using it to find information about, especially people, like looking at the citations and everything to see where I can find more information. When I know something and I have, a citation for it, of course. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, okay, I can add that here. I can add that here. So I kind of just add as I go. And I think that's part of what is so wonderful about it, because you have those kind of small community contribution opportunities.
I mean, there's so many things I like about Wikidata. It's hard to like. I plan on doing Wikidata once I retire. Actually, I'm looking forward to retirement so I can work more with Wikidata, because I don't get a chance to do it as much now. But I was like, I'm a crusty old cataloger, and it makes me feel like I'm actually creating linked data, right? I'm not just experimenting and learning, like I'm doing something, and I can share that. And also, I think it can help enhance the reputation of my team. I mean, it's hard sometimes when you're on a campus, even within your library, to demonstrate what value you're at, what your cataloging team is adding. You're doing it, but it's hard to make it visible and make that, even if you can, make that understandable to other people on campus. But I think this is one way where that does. If you're doing something that's in the service to your campus, I think that is one way that you can really visibly demonstrate your value, that you're adding value to the whole campus community. So yeah, I think to me, that's what's exciting. So.
Oh, I'm looking forward to your retirement too, so you can do more editing. That's great. Kiley, something you said resonated with me, because in our discussion last week, Lane Raspberry, who's at the University of Virginia, said, sure, Wikidata has its problems. I'm paraphrasing here. Sorry, Lane. Wikidata has its problems, but who's doing it better? Like, it's a really ambitious project. It's really radical to pull all these different data sets together under one community and kind of like hash out the differences while building out more systems and ontologies and data models for any sort of thing. And also like pulling in all your local wiki bases like you're working on, and building out rules for that. And I find that kind of heartening. Like it's problems that other data repositories have, but they're just kind of laid bare because of the transparency of Wikidata. And I think in project work, it's nice to know that up front, so you can kind of deal with it and plan accordingly. But that just really struck a chord with me. So thanks for bringing that up. All right, here's my next question for you. This is a great one. So for anyone on the fence about doing a Wikidata project, or if you could grab the ear of like some department chair or the person in charge of someone else's time for a project, what would you say to them to convince them to do a Wikidata project? Like, what's so indispensable about this?
I think Chris actually said something just now, and Joe kind of said a version of the same thing, that I think the fact that you're contributing to both the institutional value and to kind of a global information community. I mean, it's so much bigger than just the specific project that you run. It's not going to be something that you complete it, everyone learns something, of course, and there are definitely, takeaways from it, and it still has value, but it's creating something that's going to kind of persist and snowball into something bigger. Because when information is created on Wikidata, of course, sometimes things, have to get removed or have to get shifted, etc. So, but I mean, the net gain of it is enormous, because once you have that little bit of information, a little bit more gets added, a little bit more gets added, a little bit more gets added, until it's something so much bigger than what you started with. So I think both benefiting the people who are participating, especially in the cases of projects that it really focuses on data literacy, it's a really great opportunity for that. But also what you actually create, that information kind of grows and grows and grows.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does depend where you're coming from and what you find convincing. I mean, I think for anybody in a cataloging unit, the idea of being able to make your contributions like public and reliable, it may not feel like you're reaping the benefits right now, but like it's there. Like whatever you put there, you can always get later. Like if something your catalog is able to pull that data in at some point, like you've already done that work. So it's, and if somebody else's catalog can pull it in, like you've already done that work and they don't have to do it. I think for me as a repository manager, there's the idea of, once you you hop in and sort of tidy up your own connections and make your own, as much as you can, your own stuff as visible and as accessible as possible. Like suddenly you think like, why isn't everybody doing this? Because it's an easy way to make your own, whatever you're concerned with, make it so that other people can be like, oh, hey, I'll grab some of that, or I'll do the same thing so that you can take mine and I'll take yours. And then, I think about like reference librarians, even like you have all the time you get difficult requests that rely on some sort of really obscure fact or data source or something. And like, how cool would it be if you could just save other people time and jump into Wikidata and find a way to make that more visible instead of somewhere. And if somebody happens to ask the same question and somebody remembers that question was asked, we'll know where to go, but otherwise we just have to do it all over again.
I think that's something that's really refreshing about working with Wikidata too, especially like as a cataloger or like a metadata librarian. What you're producing, people are seeing it, but you don't necessarily see them seeing it. So there's kind of a feeling sometimes of being very siloed from, I created this or participated in creating it, of course. And I know people are using it, but it's kind of, they're on the other side of this wall and I don't actually see them using it unless we get like feedback about it. But with Wikidata and Wikipedia too, of course, you can see that kind of participation about it, where people either, challenge what you said or add to it or what have you. You can really see the kind of ecosystem from a very different point of view.
I'm terrible at elevator speeches, and so Kiley and Joe said things a lot better than me. What I would say is like there are really low barriers. Like I was going in 10 minutes, right? I was creating stuff in 10 minutes, and you don't have to be. Kiley and Joe, they do really cool techie stuff. I've told Joe before, I'm like the low tech version of I'm the low tech poster boy for this thing, because if you can use a spreadsheet. You don't even need to use a spreadsheet. If you can type, you can do Wikidata. And so you can get anybody involved in this, right? And so you just need a little guidance. You need a little template to get people, all pulling in the same direction. But this is something anyone can do in a really short amount of time. We're talking minutes, right? With a little bit of preparation ahead of time. So.
All right, all you supervisors out there, I hope you heard those answers because I think they're great. Here's to some future new Wikidata projects. Kiley, another thing you said resonated with me, which was the de-siloing. People always mention this about Wikidata, but they only mention it in terms of the data. And what the three of you just said, it's like a de-siloing of community. It's a de-siloing of institutional knowledge, where like if any of us leave a position or someone leaves a position, all that Wikidata stuff is still there. And if you're like collectively tracking workflows, all of those are still there too. And the community, the Wikidata community at large also has like workflows embedded in them too. So there's like a multi-dimensional de-siloing, put that on a t-shirt, that's happening with Wikidata projects too, which I think is really cool. All right, I've got a handful of questions, just 2 or 3 more left, and then I'll switch to the question and answer form. Thank you for filling that out so far, anyone who's submitted, and a quick plug to add any additional questions to the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom window. But my next question for the 3 of you is, congratulations, you've got endless resources at your fingertips all of a sudden. You can do any linked data project that you want. You've got an infinite time frame. What do you want to do?
I would like to create, if I had endless resources, endless time, create a Wikidata item for anyone who produced any sort of work, populate that Wikidata item with all sorts of relationships they've had with other people and authors and things like that, and then create Wikidata items for all the actual works they've created and tie all of that together. And because that's really, to me, that's the great thing about Wikidata. It enables you to code in relationships that other sort of platforms don't allow you to do. And I think you can, the querying feature is so powerful that you can find relationships between collaborators and other people that that you might not be able to in other things. So I think that's what I would do. That's what a crusty old cataloger would do, is just get it all out there and link it all together. So
I would work on adding citations where there are missing citations or just imported from Wikipedia citations. I think that's what I would do, because the information is out there. Not to sound like I'm doing an X-Files tagline, but the information is out there. So being able to kind of add those citations and make those relationships between information being elsewhere with kind of a more, I guess, of that research using Wikidata as a starting point.
I kind of had both of those on my list. I was torn. I was going to wait and see if each of you solved my problems first with all of your unending resources. Like for the repository side of me, I feel like I would love to upload all of the articles that we have in the repository, not just the ones that have DOIs that we create, but all the other publications, so that the ones without identifiers have some notion of identifier. People can add their URLs to where those are hosted. That's like the work side of me. I think the librarian side of me would be more like Chris's thing, where I would love to just sort of have constantly train librarians to be like, listen, linked data and Wikidata aren't that hard. It's just like, you just have to jump in and do it. And to show people that, there's this real benefit to the profession generally and our institutions to engage it, and that it's not like this, you don't have to be really technologically inclined or really comfortable with technology. You just have to be willing to jump in. And I think having a space where you can constantly remind people of that would be, maybe we'll just keep doing more of these sessions where we just keep going with this.
Such exciting answers. I love this question because it's fun to not have constraints for once, right? Well, I hope all of these projects come true because they sound fantastic to me. And this last question I have before switching to the Q&A is a fun one. So the whole point of these series, this series, is that it's Wikidata's birthday. Wikidata's turning 10, which is crazy. So 10 years ago, we couldn't do any of these cool things that we're talking about now. Where do you see things in 5 years? And you can interpret that any way you want, whether it's at a project level, like a management level, like a societal impact level, with Wikidata and linked data. Just kind of curious.
Well, from a cataloger's perspective, I see Wikidata as something that's going to be incorporated into our production environment, maybe not to replace our traditional authority control, but to definitely complement and expand. And I say that because the Library of Congress is beginning to sort of encourage their catalogers to do a fuller description in Wikidata, create a fulsome Wikidata item, and then convert that into a very skinny NACO record. So, and I can see the possibilities for that, because there's a lot more things and a lot more relationships among people and concepts that you can encode in a Wikidata item than you ever can in a NACO record. So I think the shorter, and especially in a linked data environment, which I've always been told, every entity needs an identifier. Well, Wikidata is such a low barrier way to do that, that I just see it becoming incorporated into our normal workflows. So.
I think my answer would actually kind of be the same for Wikidata and Wikipedia. I want to see more discussion of both of them in the context of information literacy and data literacy, because obviously Wikipedia has such an enormous user base, and so does Wikidata, but kind of in a slightly different sphere. And I think discussing both of them, both in terms of making them better and understanding what some of the challenges are, but also how to use them as is, and how that sort of conversation opens the door to more complicated conversations of data and information literacy. And the fact that what we're working with isn't perfect, but all information is a starting point to other information. And the fact that when we're using Wikidata, the most common complaint I hear about it is, well, there's a lot of problems with it. Well, of course, there's a lot of problems with it. I mean, there's a lot of problems with everything. That's how the world works. Nothing is perfect. Nothing is complete. There are going to be errors and inconsistencies, little technical problems, maybe duplicate records, etc. So understanding how we approach it with that in mind, even as we work to make it better, which I mean is constantly the work that's being done, right? So understanding how we kind of take everything that we're consuming for whatever reason with a grain of salt, I think is a good point to kind of start those conversations of information literacy, and the fact that both of these are incredible resources and we shouldn't be saying, well, don't use it because it's not perfect. Just that's not helpful. I mean, it's there and people are going to be using it. So one of the things that I think I would like to see in 5 years is both those of us that are kind of more directly involved in the work, but also people maybe who aren't contributors or editors, but are existing in the sort of information space that everyone is, where these things are very, very present in our information ecosystem, and kind of having those conversations of, yeah, like, let's talk about how we can use this well.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this as sort of a classic choose your own adventure, and it depends on the librarians and their institutions. Like, it's possible that, like many cool possibilities in the library sphere, we could just be like, like, it's okay, but I'll ignore it. And then, in 5 years, all of the commercial entities will be like, oh, look at all this free data that we can just repackage and sell to libraries because, that's what libraries do. And I think that if the librarians can really find a way, like Chris said, to like work it, find a way to get it into your workflow, and you have people of all different ranges of skills and interests, and once the sort of the idea of Wikidata is there and the like how it can be used in the different things, instead of the library model being repackage this open data and sell it back to us, it's something that I think the libraries can start and librarians can start, I'll contribute to this data set. I know that it's there if I need it, and we can build things, for the library that capitalize on the actual effort instead of just waiting for somebody else to put make it different colors and call it something else, even though it's still pulling from Wikidata.
Oh, I love all of these responses. It's a bright future if we want it to be. So we got a lot of work to do, but these are great visions. So thank you for sharing those with all of us. We've got some great questions in the Q&A section, so I want to shift to those. Emma writes, this is a question for Kiley. Can you talk about how you're relating your Wikibase stack to Wikidata, if at all, and what property you're using to establish relationships between items, and how you've modeled your local stack versus how Wikidata does it? Just any insights on that?
Yeah, so the way that I had structured it was I started by creating the properties that I needed to kind of replicate our application profile. And then, of course, you have to kind of build out from there in order to have all of the values that are in the application profile. So places, people, etc. And then creating, the entities for all of them, the items for all of them. And part of what I did was on people, places, identifiable things that I could link out to Wikidata, I did similarly to what Wikidata does for other identifiers, where I would have the property of Wikidata identifier and have that linked to the QID. That way a user could just click on that ID and go right to Wikidata and then out from Wikidata to there. And if there was also a corresponding Wikipedia article, I included that as well. That way it was just, cut one step out possibly. For establishing the relationship between items, part of the way that I also think it needs to be improved the way that I did it, but part of the relationship was that you could see what item records, which like digital objects, a person or a place appeared in, which the way that I did it didn't necessarily work that well. So that's something I would really need to revisit when we kind of come back to this project, because it just wasn't very effective. But also querying for that every time is not necessarily effective. So that specifically is something that I kind of need to re-explore. But the ability of having those properties kind of all appear on the page and having them all linked to each other was one of the reasons why we chose to kind of pursue this and why I worked on the proof of concept of it. Oh, I just lost the question. There we go. Yeah, so modeling what data lived in our instance versus a corresponding Wikidata item. Basically everything that was specific to us, so our specific metadata fields that appear in the digital collections for that application profile, that all lived in our local instance. But anything like in some cases we had like years, like birth year, death year, etc. And that was a difficult choice to make because I would have rather just had that in the like corresponding Wikidata item. But in a lot of cases, since the people are specific to us and did not already have a Wikidata item, I was kind of ending up reproducing it in both places. So that's another thing that kind of needs a little bit of adjustment to move forward, because part of the issue is that we don't have the ability to replicate every single one of these in Wikidata itself. But when I'm doing the batch imports, that lets me populate it in our instance. So we were kind of going about it backwards as I was doing that, where it was in our instance, but not necessarily in Wikidata immediately. So that was something that needed to be built into our workflow, was having a mechanism of some kind where we could then pop it into Wikidata. So like either taking it and modifying it and just uploading it with quick statements to put it as an item in Wikidata. But that was kind of not quite as far as I got.
Great response. Thanks for that, Kylie. We just have 2 minutes left, 2 more questions. So these will be quick responses and short answers, which I think you're perfect for. Mary's asking, I think this was from Chris. You say you can explain in 10 minutes how to get started. What's a good resource for that? So does anyone have a resource that jumps to the top of their mind?
Wikidata.org. There's a lot of great tutorials on there. So I have all my catalogers look through that first. So do the tutorials.
And I think along with that too, knowing how to navigate the different like page structures. So how instead of searching like for an item, how to search for a resource page too is very helpful.
And isn't there like whatever the Wikidata for librarians or information specialists, wherever that page is, there's a whole like, I mean, Will tell you. I think you told me, but there are some like good hand-holding resources that are, Chris isn't overestimating that. Like 10 minutes is really awesome.
It's kind of overwhelming, and I would just recommend whatever it is you're interested in, try to find that corresponding resource. And if you can't find it, ask me or anyone in this call, because we're all happy to help you. All right, last question is from Alan. Where can we learn more about your projects, see more about your projects? Let everyone know. Quick round of information.
On the LD4 recording, I don't have a URL for it at the moment, but I think that's the only place that mine is actually discussed in any sort of detail at the moment.
The PCC Wikidata pilot has a page. I don't know the link off the top of my head, but all the pilot projects are linked off of there, and ours is one of them. So
I'm dropping mine in the chat.
Wonderful. So a lot of different ways to learn more, and I'm sure that Kylie, Joe, and Chris would welcome any emails from anyone if you have specific follow-up questions. We're out of time. I want to respect everyone's schedules. So I just want to give our panelists one big, huge thank you and virtual round of applause. Thanks for spending this past hour with us, for all the attendees. Thanks for your great questions. Thanks for attending. We'll be doing 2 more of these, one next week, 1 week from today, actually, and then one the last week of October. So stay tuned. And then there are all those other really great Wikidata events. But Chris, Kylie, Joe, one more big thank you from me and everyone else watching online or in person. Thank you guys for sharing your expertise with us.
Yeah, thanks, Will, for organizing.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Thanks, everyone.